Hello, I'm Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas and Editor-in-Chief of the Texas National Security Review. Many of our listeners know that TNSR is supported in part by the Clements Center. Few of our listeners may know what the Clements Center is and who the name honors. The William P. Clements Jr. Center for National Security draws on the best insights of diplomatic and military history to train the next generation of national security policymakers, leaders, and scholars. Established in 2013 with the support of distinguished policymakers and scholars, the Clements Center is a nonpartisan research and policy center uniquely positioned in the Office of the President. The Clements Center honors former Texas Governor Bill Clements and his leadership on national security, especially during his service as Deputy Secretary of Defense from 1973 to 77 in the Nixon and Ford administrations. Bill Clements managed the Pentagon and helped guide American national security policy during a critical time. He brought a deep appreciation for history to every aspect of his leadership, policies, and decision-making. We're fortunate to have a unique source of insight into Bill Clements, the man. George Seay, who is the chairman of the Clements Center Board, is a distinguished business leader who has also served in government under Deputy Secretary of State Larry Eagleburger during the administration of President George H.W. Bush. George is also Bill Clements' grandson. Clements started from humble beginnings. Here he is describing his start in a C-SPAN interview from 1991.
Well, it's going to be hard for you to believe this, but my family was having significant economic problems when I finished high school at Hallam Park High School there in Dallas. And I had scholarships to go play football and so forth and so on that I had to give up. And I went to the oil fields and started working in the oil fields when I was 17 years old. And I stayed out of school for 15 months. And then I went back to SMU Engineering School, and every summer and so forth, well, I'd work in the oil field. So really, from the time I was 17 years old, I have been associated in one way or another with the oil fields, and went into my own business as a drilling contractor in January 1947 after World War II. And started with absolutely nothing on borrowed money and two old worn-out drilling rigs, and built it into a big international drilling company.
His spirit made an impression on his grandson, too.
He was an all-state football player at 160 pounds and class president, and he's going to SMU on a football scholarship at age 17. And his parents come up to him after graduation and say, "Hey, son, we're broke, and we're declaring bankruptcy, and you need to go to work, and you're not going to go play football." And at age 17, he goes to the South Texas oil fields and starts roughnecking a week after high school graduation. That just kind of sums it all up. I think most people don't understand what roughnecking is like, but a lot of people lose fingers and arms and all sorts of things because it's an incredibly dangerous operation. It's very physical. It's long hours, and it's incredibly dangerous.
Although Clements never graduated from college, he had a lifelong passion for learning.
He was self-taught, and his library in the schoolhouse building for his corporate headquarters is pretty legendary. In its time, being the largest library on all things Texas there is out there, but it also had a lot of books on geopolitics, grand strategy, foreign policy, culture, art, et cetera, et cetera. He was incredibly well read, and I think for young people who listen to this call, your education doesn't stop at age 25 or 28 or whenever you finish your undergrad or master's or PhD or postdoc work or whatever you end up doing. It's just beginning then. And the capability you find as a professional is going to be dependent on how much you self-educate yourself through your reading and through your profession in the years to come after your formal education concludes.
And that's, of course, where we get so much of the animating intellectual spirit for the Clements Center's mission of applying the insights of history to current policy challenges. That's what Bill Clements did his whole life, as you were saying, a lifelong student and devoted reader of history, even if he didn't have the formal degrees in it. Bill Clements was not just learning for its own sake. He believed passionately in serving his country. The opportunity for him to do that came during the 1970s at the Pentagon. The next really landmark phase in Bill Clements' career was his time serving as Deputy Secretary of Defense in the Nixon and Ford administration from 73 to 77. Because you had talked there about the tremendous international experience he got as well as the management experience. Tell us more about how he ended up in that leadership role at the Pentagon.
He got the job in the Defense Department because in 1968, Nixon offered him to be ambassador to West Germany, which is probably one of the 2 or 3 most prominent diplomatic posts in the world at the time because of the Cold War. And he declined because he said, I'm running a company and I don't want to go do diplomacy. Can you imagine Bill Clements as a diplomat? I mean, that would have been highly entertaining. But in 72, Nixon came back to him after he'd been finance chairman for Nixon in Texas for 2 straight elections and said, Bill, what do you want? And my grandfather said, I want to run DOD. He said, I don't want to be secretary because the secretary flies all over the place and sits in on meetings and does press conferences, but he doesn't run the building. I want to run the building. So I want to be number 2. I want to be deputy secretary, and I want to report directly to you. So I work for you. I don't work for the secretary. And I want to pick every single person under the department, civilian under me. I want to pick every single person, all the undersecretaries, all the assistant secretaries, all the deputy assistant secretaries. And I want it in writing, so we have a contract. And remarkably, Nixon agreed to all that. I think there was a model of running the country back then where you found the most formidable, capable people and let them run the cabinet agencies.
Clements was proud of both the complexity of the challenges he took on at DOD and the management style he brought to the organization. Here he is discussing it in a campaign ad for his first run for the Texas governorship.
In 1972, I said I would become the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And those problems in the Defense Department cover the total spectrum. Defense contracts, small business contracts, minority contracts, weapons systems. But the basic criteria in any management function, be it the Department of Defense or be it Governor of the state of Texas, is to surround yourself with the absolutely best people possible. Not in one of those interviews did I ever ask one of those people, what is your political party?
He filled out DOD with the most formidable, impressive people he could get. He made them all promise to stay 4 years up there and work for him. And he ran the building through the Yom Kippur War, through the change from a draft to a volunteer military force, through the withdrawal from Vietnam, through the worst period of the Cold War, where a lot of people thought the Soviet Union pulled fairly close to us in parity in terms of military might. And you've quoted him, Will, on many instances saying the President of the United States should never go to the negotiating table as the second most powerful country in the world. And I think that was kind of his goal. And also on his watch, he was kind of viewed as the father of the cruise missile because the military brass were violently opposed to a cruise missile type development program, and he got it ramrodded through the military brass, which anybody who's been affiliated with the Pentagon knows that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And the F-14, F-16, F-18, Abrams tank, several other weapon systems were all developed on his watch. So I think most people think that, I think this is objective. He and David Packard were the 2 most successful deputy secretaries in the history of the building, and he served there all 4 years. He was acting secretary or deputy secretary all 4 years, and he worked while he was there. There were 3 defense secretaries in place, and it was his favorite job he ever had. He loved that job. He loved his country. He loved serving his country. He loved working with the military.
Well, and as I've reminded audiences before, which I think is really remarkable, it's not just that Bill Clements led the Pentagon through so many transformations and was one of the lead architects of some of those really revolutionary weapons systems, including a lot that are still the backbone of American force projection today. But he did it during an unbelievably difficult political and economic environment. The Congress was very hostile to defense spending. The post-Vietnam, post-Watergate Congress comes in and they're slashing defense budgets. You have President Nixon resign during that time. National morale plummets because of Watergate, as well as the foreign policy challenges we were facing around the world between the OPEC oil embargo and the Yom Kippur War and Soviet advances across the world. And so the fact that Clements was able to come in and for DOD historians, this is the time of the second offset. So how can we do more with less? How can we leverage American technology and innovation when we're not going to have just the raw mass and the raw dollars to throw at the challenges anymore? So
it was unquestionably the hardest time to run the building in the modern era. I mean, you can pick any era up against that. We had just completely bombed out of Vietnam. We went from a draft to a volunteer army. We were being challenged by the Soviets all over the world. We had stagflation in our economy. There was all this anti-military sentiment after Vietnam. It was a terrible time to have to run that building, but it was also a mission-critical time. And for all those out there who are considering careers in public service, who already have careers in public service, I want to say that one of the great things about serving your country is the people you meet. And I want to give two examples of that. Bill Clements oversaw the big military airlift with Henry Kissinger during the Yom Kippur War that basically saved Israel's bacon during that period of time. And it was a great experience for him. And he formed a lifelong friendship with Shimon Peres, the later prime minister of Israel, one of the great statesmen of Israel. And that was a great relationship.
When Clements' time at the Pentagon ended, he wasn't done with public service. Here, in a C-SPAN interview recorded in 1991, he speaks of some of his post-Pentagon activities.
I have served on 2 presidential commissions that I was asked to serve on, that has to do with our strategic weapon systems and the Defense Department. And so my relationship with the Secretary and with the the Deputy Secretary and the Defense Department has really continued through the years. And for many years I was active and served on the Defense Science Board. So my interest in this sort of thing, the national security aspects, the geopolitical situation, it has continued through all those years.
Clements was not a politician. He had been urged to run for public office for years because everybody saw his leadership abilities. They were very, very glaring. And he finally got talked into running for governor of Texas by a New Mexico U.S. senator who had been in town for the Willis Tate lecture series at SMU, which Clements had in part funded. And Clements interviewed him on energy policy and national security the night before, and he was a house guest. And he said, "You just got to run for governor. We've got to have you run for governor." And most people around the rest of the country just think of Texas as a red state, but you go back 40 years ago, it's a little over 40 years ago now, and the state was blue as you can get, and it had never been red. It had been Democrat forever. Now, it was a conservative form of the Democratic Party, which doesn't exist anymore. But there had been one Republican governor in 110, 15 years in Texas, and that was a phony Republican governor. He served one term and was elected during Reconstruction when anyone associated with the Confederacy, which was probably 90% of adult Texas at that point, couldn't vote in state elections back then. So that was kind of an aberration. And so running for governor of Texas as a Republican was a witless, laughable endeavor at that point. But he decided, and not to use colorful language again, but the way he described to me was, if you run for public office, you don't care who else is running. Your methodology is piss on the fire, get out of my way. Everybody else can go home. I'm going to run everybody else down and win, period. End of story. I don't care who else is in the race. And that's the way he ran for governor.
And again, as you were saying, Texas was a one-party state at the time. It was all Democratic. And so for someone to run as a Republican was just crazy.
Well, he had 3 things that he really had going for him that allowed him to win. One was his irascible, unique, very blunt personality. He was very unique in Texas politics that way. There was no diplomacy. There was no nicety. It was just, here it is right in your face, whether you like it or not. And it was exemplified in that election with him throwing a rubber chicken at his opponent, John Hill, at a dinner in Amarillo. Because there was an old adage of, if you want to teach a dog to behave and do the right thing, you tied a dead chicken around its neck until it stunk really bad, and the dog got sick of it, and it would be trained to do what you wanted to do that way. And of course, in modern Texas, nobody knew of that analogy. It showed how much rural roots Clements had, and everybody at that dinner was horrified by it. But it just was something only a character would do, and everybody got a big laugh out of that. So his personality was a big deal. His money was a big deal. He had founded the largest drilling company in the world, and he had adequate resources to run a professional, modern, first-class, statewide campaign, and that had never been done by a Republican or a Democrat in Texas political history. It was much different back then. And then third, the incumbent governor, who's a conservative Democrat and a real gentleman, a man named Dolph Briscoe, lost the primary to a representative of the more liberal element of the Democratic Party in Texas back then, John Hill. And so there was a giant rebellion among conservative Democrats because they didn't like John Hill.
So Clements was able to reach across the aisle then and, get a lot of Democratic support, too, for winning.
Oh, there was a big group of Democrats for Clements, and Janie Briscoe, Governor Briscoe's wife, endorsed Bill Clements. I mean, that was unheard of. And if you don't have all three of those factors, he loses for sure, just like every other Republican for over 100 years. But with all three of those factors and his overwhelming energy and force of personality, he had a county chairman in all 254 counties in Texas, first time that had ever happened. And John Hill's gross overconfidence, Hill started the race 52 percentage points ahead.
Wow, 52.
Yeah, if you think about that, probably that and Ted Cruz's win over then Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst in the Senate election are probably the two biggest upsets in modern Texas political history. Cruz came from nowhere. He was low single digits when he started, and he actually somehow pulled it off. Clements was behind 52%. The Clements victory was even a bigger upset, but those are probably the two biggest. And it was pretty remarkable to watch it play out. He won, I believe, by 16,000 votes. It might have been 13,000, but it was right in that range. And also John Tower, who was the only other Republican in Texas at the time and had been elected in kind of a fluke election. Tower won by even less that year. He won by 6,000 votes over the always unlucky Bob Kruger, who was appointed a U.S. Senator for a while to fill an empty seat, but he never could win an election on his own. He always barely lost.
John Tower was the iconic chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So,
Without Clements on the ballot that year, Tower would have lost for sure.
Clements capitalized on his experience in the national security sector to promote his qualification to serve as governor as well. Here he is in a televised debate during that first contentious campaign.
I have been a manager for the past 30 years. I was the general manager as the Deputy Secretary of Defense of the Department of Defense. I am a manager. That's what I am. If my opponent has ever managed anything other than a small law office, I don't know what it was. So when you start talking about managing a $16 billion budget and 137,000 state employees, I am the only candidate who has had that kind of an experience. My budget in the Department of Defense was over $100 billion a year, and we had 3 million people on the payroll. So I think I can bring the kind of management to the governor's office that does not represent on-the-job training. If anybody's going to get training down there, it's my opponent.
And then, so Clements ends up serving 2 non-consecutive terms as governor. What were his main priorities and accomplishments as Texas governor?
It's kind of ironic because he kind of was a bifurcated public servant. You mostly think of these country club Republicans, blue bloods, and he definitely hung out with the country club Republican set. And in that set, I would put George H.W. Bush and James Baker and Peter O'Donnell and people like that, kind of the establishment. But since he had started out life as a broke roughneck, he was much more. He hung around with the blue bloods because he'd been so successful financially, but his demeanor was very blue collar. So he really appealed to the blue collar voter, and he was not of a mind to dabble in pleasantries and niceties and typical politicking that most career politicians do. You got it right between the eyes every time, and it was very blunt, and he was very specific about what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was professionalize state government, which it really wasn't that time. He wanted good people as employees. He wanted to cut the number of employees so it was not fat from a standpoint of personnel count. And he wanted to run the government like a business and keep it lean and mean and as limited as possible. So he was a classic Republican like that. And he didn't spend as much time on the social issues or the politics. He just wanted to get things done. And I think most people view his greatest legacy was that he balanced the budget and left a huge surplus in his first term. And then in his second term, he oversaw the state during the worst economic times we've had since the Depression or till now. Now is a match for the late 80s. The late 80s, most people forget, who didn't grow up in Texas, was really a depression down here. The real estate industry, the oil and gas industry, the agriculture industry, the banking industry, they all fell apart. And he had to try to rebuild the economy. And the diversified Texas economy we have today, Another thing he doesn't get any credit for, which is ridiculous, because he built that. He recruited Semitech. He recruited the semiconducting super collider from D.C. He brought in all this technology money, all this healthcare money, and really single-handedly led the beginnings of the diversification of the Texas economy. So that would be a legacy. And finally, his state appointees were universally viewed as best of class. And George W. Bush is another person who's renowned for that, those two men in particular. And another thing Clements did that I really admired, Tom Luce told me about this, was if he asked you to do a job, he basically tried to find the best person and put him in that place and then let him do the job. And, if a person was doing a poor job, he'd fire him without any ceremony or sentimentality or hesitation. But as long as you're doing a great job, he just left you alone.
Clements' commitment to public service left an indelible impression on those around him, including his grandson.
I've met multiple presidents and cabinet secretaries and foreign heads of state and business titans, and Bill Clements was the most capable, the most formidable person I've ever known in my entire life by a long shot. I mean, it's not even close. And the best training I ever had in life as a young person was learning how to interact with Bill Clements. Because if you could go toe-to-toe, one-on-one with Bill Clements, you could do that with anybody, anytime, anywhere. And other people weren't that difficult because he was so formidable and he challenged everybody right up front. I would re-urge people to really do some research on Bill Clements and the Clements papers that you oversaw the digitization of, Will, are a great place to start. It's a remarkable man, remarkable legacy. He certainly was far from perfect, but he was the most formidable person I've ever been around, and he's worthy of study. And I wish we had a whole lot more like him running the country. We'd run a lot better, and things would work better, and there'd be less of this partisan bickering and silliness because he didn't tolerate any of that. So I appreciate the opportunity to visit about Clements and his legacy and the Clements Center, which we're so proud of.
We at the Clements Center are proud to carry on the legacy of Bill Clements, too. We do so by teaching students how to integrate the wisdom of history with current challenges and to prepare for careers as policymakers and scholars, by supporting research on history, strategy, and statecraft, and by convening scholars and policymakers to improve our understanding of history, statecraft, and national security. We hope this brief look at the life of Bill Clements by some of those who knew, loved, and admired him will help to explain why we are so proud to honor his memory by carrying his name on our center.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.